The saloon doors exploded inward with a violence that made every glass freeze halfway to trembling lips. Vernon Ashford staggered through the threshold, his cracked boots scraping against warped floorboards that had absorbed decades of spilled whiskey and broken dreams. Behind him, he dragged a figure so small and broken, she seemed carved from shadow itself, his daughter Maggie, no more than 16, her threadbare dress hanging loose on a frame that spoke of too many missed meals and too much fear. "Now listen here, you worthless sons of bitches." Vernon's voice cracked through Murphy's saloon like a bullwhip, though his words slurred with the liquid courage that had become his only companion. "Got myself a trade to make that'll interest every man jack of you." The silence that followed was absolute suffocating. 23 souls sat frozen in their chairs, eyes locked desperately on amber whiskey and worn playing cards, hands trembling around glass and hope. In Deadwood Crossing, survival meant learning which sights were too dangerous to witness, which sounds too deadly to acknowledge. The town had rules unspoken, but absolute see nothing, hear nothing, speak nothing, that might draw the attention of those who ruled through fear. Vernon Ashford had moved beyond caring about survival. The crushing weight of debt had been slowly strangling him for months, squeezing the last drops of human decency from his alcohol-soaked soul. Desperation had finally driven him past the point of no return, past the place where a man might still call himself a father. He yanked Maggie forward with calloused fingers that had once been gentle, and she stumbled, catching herself against a scarred table before straightening with a dignity that seemed impossible given her circumstances. "This here's my daughter Maggie." Vernon announced, his voice gaining strength from the depths of his degradation. "Pretty little thing, ain't she? Young, strong, knows her way around hard work. Worth at least 3 bottles of the good whiskey, maybe 4, if a man's inclined to be generous." In the darkest corner of the establishment, where shadows gathered like vultures and the lamplight barely penetrated, Elias Brody felt something shatter inside his chest. The 55-year-old rancher had been nursing the same whiskey for 4 hours, letting it grow warm in hands that bore the scars of 20 years fighting this unforgiving land. His cattle were dying of disease, his crops withered to dust, his ranch slowly crumbling like his will to live. The drought had been merciless this year, turning the valley into a moonscape of cracked earth and bleached bones. But worse than any of that was the memory that haunted him every waking moment. Lucy, his beloved daughter, dead for 3 years now, and the guilt that ate at him like acid. He'd failed her when she needed him most, had been too blind to see the danger closing around her, too weak to protect her from the monsters that walked among them wearing badges and smiles. Watching Vernon Ashford auction his child like livestock, Elias felt rage rise in him that he hadn't experienced since finding Lucy's broken body in the desert. The fury burned away, 3 years of numbness, replacing it with something harder and more dangerous than grief. In Maggie's terrified green eyes, he saw echoes of his daughter's last moments, and the sight ignited something in his soul that he'd thought was dead forever. Maggie Ashford stood motionless in the center of the saloon, her gaze scanning the room, with the wariness of prey surrounded by predators. If shame touched her, she buried it beneath layers of survival instinct honed by years of abuse. If terror consumed her, she showed only the slight tremor in her clenched fists. Her spine remained straight as forged steel, a testament to some inner strength that hadn't yet been broken by her father's cruelty or the town's indifference. The girl had learned early that tears were a luxury she couldn't afford, that showing weakness only invited more pain. At 16, she'd already seen more cruelty than most adults could imagine, had endured things that would break stronger souls. But something in her refused to bend, refused to accept that this was all life had to offer. And Vernon. Elias's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried across the room with the authority of rolling thunder. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Every eye in the saloon turned toward the weathered rancher, surprise and fear warring in faces that had grown accustomed to silence. Breaking that silence was dangerous, everyone knew that. But Elias Brody had reached the point where danger seemed preferable to disgrace. Vernon turned bloodshot eyes, struggling to focus on the man who dared break the town's conspiracy of silence. When recognition dawned, his lip curled in contempt. "Well, if it ain't Elias Brody. Should have known you'd poke your nose where it don't belong. Mind your own business, you washed-up fool. A man selling his daughter is everybody's business." Elias stood slowly joints, protesting after hours in the uncomfortable chair. Age and grief had worn him down to weathered leather and bone, but his voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. No decent human being stands by and watches this happen. Decent. Vernon's laugh was bitter as alkali water. That's rich coming from a man who couldn't even protect his own blood. Maybe if you'd minded your business 3 years back, you'd understand about making hard choices. The reference to Lucy hit Elias like a physical blow, driving the breath from his lungs and nearly buckling his knees. But he didn't retreat. Instead, he reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a small leather pouch, his life savings, everything he had left in this world. The coins clinked together with the sound of desperation and hope. "How much do you owe?" he asked, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. $47. Greed lit Vernon's eyes like flames dancing in a skull. "You carrying $47, Brody, because if you ain't keep your mouth shut and let me conduct my business." Elias counted the money with deliberate slowness, making each movement a statement of purpose. The coins felt heavy in his palm, weighted with the knowledge that this was his last chance to do something right. $32.16, not enough. But then he unclasped his father's gold watch, the only thing of value he still possessed, and set it on the nearest table with a decisive click. "This covers the difference," he said simply. "Elias don't." Murphy, the bartender, finally found his voice, though terror made it barely audible. The heavy-set Irishman had been wiping the same glass for 10 minutes, his hands shaking with the knowledge of what he was witnessing. "You can't, this ain't right. Your deal's made." Vernon released Maggie so suddenly she stumbled, but Elias was already moving, steadying her with gentle hands that seemed impossibly large and warm after years of her father's cruel touch. "She's your problem now, Brody. Good riddance to bad rubbish. The transaction should have been over, and then should have ended with a broken man trading his daughter for alcohol, and an old rancher trying to save a child from hell. But Deadwood Crossing had rules, and those rules were enforced by men who answered to no earthly authority." The saloon doors burst open again, and 3 men entered with the swagger of those who'd never faced consequences for their actions. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees as they crossed the threshold, their presence sucking the hope from the air like a prairie fire consuming oxygen. Cobb Jackson led them, his massive frame blocking out the afternoon sun, cold eyes settling on Maggie with predatory interest. At 6'4" and 200 pounds of muscle and meanness, he was Marshal Thorne's chief enforcer, the man who turned the marshal's words into action. Behind him came Pete Dalton and Snake Morrison, both wearing badges that gleamed like lies in the lamplight. "Well, well." Cobb drawled, his voice like broken glass grinding underfoot. "Looks like we missed the entertainment. That's unfortunate." Marshal Thorne was looking forward to meeting young Miss Ashford personally. The mention of Marshal Cale Thorne's name sent a ripple of fear through the saloon. Thorne ruled Deadwood Crossing through a combination of legal authority and extra-legal violence, his word as final as divine judgment. If Thorne wanted something or someone, resistance was not just futile, but fatal. Elias felt ice form in his veins, but he kept his voice steady. "She's not available. The transaction's complete." "Is it?" Cobb's smile was all teeth and malice, the expression of a shark that had smelled blood in the water. "See, the marshal has a prior claim on Miss Ashford here. Her father owes considerable debts to certain business associates of ours. Debts that need settling. I just settled them. $47. Snake Morrison's laugh was high and cruel, like the sound of a rusty gate swinging in the wind. Hell, old man, that barely covers the weekly interest. Vernon here owes us closer to 200+ penalties for late payment and administrative fees. The number hit the room like thunder. $200 was more money than most families in Deadwood Crossing saw in 2 years. It was an impossible sum designed to ensure that debtors could never escape their obligations. That's a lie. Vernon protested, but his voice lacked conviction. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he realized the trap he'd walked into. You said 47 would clear everything. Did we? Cobb's expression was mockingly thoughtful. Must have been a misunderstanding. Numbers can be so confusing when a man's been drinking. Isn't that right, Pete? Absolutely. Pete Dalton agreed, his reedy voice dripping with false sympathy. Poor Vernon's been under considerable stress lately. Financial troubles, family problems, the burden of raising a difficult daughter. A man can get confused about the details of his obligations. Elias understood the game now. They'd never intended to let Maggie go free. The debt was a fiction, a tool to claim ownership of anyone they desired. And Marshall Thorne desired this girl for reasons that made Elias's stomach turn. "Oh, what's your business with her?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Marshall Thorne runs a respectable enterprise. Pete Dalton said, his voice taking on the oily tone of a snake oil salesman. Helps young ladies find employment in service positions. Good, honest work for girls with limited options. Room and board provided, of course. Very generous terms. Service positions. The euphemism made Elias want to reach for his gun, but 3 against 1 were impossible odds, especially when the 3 were professional killers. Still, something in Maggie's terrified face, something that reminded him painfully of Lucy, made him step forward instead of back. "She's under my protection now," he said simply. "Anyone who wants her goes through me." "That can be arranged." Cobb replied, his hand moving to his gun butt with casual menace. "You sure you want to die for some whore you've known for 5 minutes?" The insult ignited something dangerous in Elias's chest. She's not a whore. She's a child. And any man who can't see the difference isn't worth the powder to blow him to hell. Tension crackled through the saloon like electricity before a storm. Every patron held their breath, waiting for the inevitable explosion of violence. Hands moved toward weapons chairs scraped against floorboards as men prepared to dive for cover, and the air itself seemed to thicken with the promise of death. But before anyone could draw, Maggie Ashford did something that surprised everyone in the room. She laughed. It wasn't hysterical laughter or the bitter sound of despair. It was genuine amusement, clear and bright as spring water cutting through the oppressive atmosphere. Every eye turned to her confusion, replacing aggression as the unexpected sound broke the deadly spell. "You boys sure do work hard to sound impressive," she said, her voice carrying a strength that hadn't been there moments before. "All that bluster and posturing. Reminds me of the roosters back on the farm, lot of noise and flapping, but when it comes down to it, they're just birds." Cobb's face flushed with anger, his hand tightening on his weapon. "You got a smart-mouth girl. We'll fix that soon enough. Will you?" Maggie tilted her head, studying him with the intensity of a scientist examining an interesting specimen. "Because, from where I'm standing, you look like 3 grown men, afraid of 1 teenage girl and an old rancher. That's not impressive. That's pathetic." The observation hit its mark like a perfectly aimed arrow. Cobb's jaw clenched, and for a moment it seemed he might draw his gun right there in front of 24 witnesses. But even in his rage, he was smart enough to recognize the problems that would create. Better to wait to find a more private moment for violence. "We'll be seeing you again real soon," he promised, backing toward the door. his pale eyes fixed on Maggie with the intensity of a hunter marking his prey. "Both of you. Count on it." "Looking forward to it," Maggie replied with a sweet smile that didn't reach her eyes. After they left, the saloon remained silent for a long moment. Then gradually conversation resumed, though it stayed muted and nervous. Everyone understood what had just happened. A line had been drawn in the dust, and blood would follow as surely as night followed day. "You shouldn't have done that," Murphy said quietly, polishing a glass with shaking hands. "Thorne don't forgive, and he don't forget. That man's got a memory like a steel trap and a heart like a stone." "Neither do I," Elias replied, then turned to Maggie. "You ready to get out of this place?" She nodded suddenly, looking very young and very tired. The courage that had carried her through the confrontation was ebbing, leaving behind exhaustion and fear. More than ready, as they walked toward the door, Vernon Ashford called out one last time, his voice slurred with whiskey and self-pity. "Don't come crying to me when you realize what you bought, Brody. She's damaged goods through and through. Been trouble since the day she was born." Elias stopped, turned back, and looked at the broken man with something approaching pity. "The only damaged thing in this room is your soul, Vernon. And that's beyond fixing." The ride to Elias's ranch passed in silence, broken only by the creak of wagon wheels and the whisper of wind through dead grass. The drought had been merciless this year, the worst anyone could remember, turning the valley into a moonscape of cracked earth and bleached bones. What few ranches they passed showed signs of abandonment: broken fences, dark windows, the hollow feeling of hope packed up and moved on. Maggie sat rigid beside him on the wagon seat, hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on the horizon where the sun was beginning its descent behind the jagged peaks of the Devil's Backbone Mountains. The silence wasn't comfortable. It was the quiet that comes before explosions, thick with unspoken fears and barely contained desperation. The girl seemed to be holding herself together through sheer force of will, but Elias could see the cracks in her composure. Her hands trembled slightly when she thought he wasn't looking, and every unexpected sound made her flinch. Years of abuse had left their mark, teaching her to expect pain from every quarter. "Are you hungry?" Elias finally asked as his property came into view. "No, sir." Her voice was barely audible, worn thin by years of learning that speaking too loud brought consequences. "When's the last time you ate something?" She was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, Tuesday maybe. Could have been Monday. The days sort of run together. Today was Friday. The Brody Ranch had once been the pride of the territory. 300 acres of prime grazing land, a stone house built to last generations, corrals, and outbuildings that spoke of prosperity and careful planning. Elias had inherited it from his father, had built it up with his own hands, and Lucy's help had dreamed of passing it on to grandchildren who would never be born. But drought disease and heartbreak had reduced it to something barely recognizable. The main house still stood solid, the stone walls were too thick for weather to damage, but paint peeled from its window frames, the porch sagged under the weight of neglect, and weeds pushed through gaps in the floorboards. The barn leaned at a dangerous angle, its roof patched with whatever materials Elias could find. Only a dozen cattle remained, from what had once been a herd of 300. "It's not much anymore," Elias said, as he helped Maggie down from the wagon. His hands were gentle, careful not to startle her, but she still tensed at his touch. "But it's got 4 walls and a roof. Clean water, too, which is more than some can claim these days." Maggie stood in the dusty yard, her head turning slowly as she absorbed her new surroundings. Her eyes missed nothing: the broken gate hanging by one hinge, the collapsed chicken coop, the barn door that swung loose in the evening breeze. But she also noticed smaller things: wildflowers growing beside the porch, despite the drought, the careful way someone had patched the worst holes in the barn roof, the sense that despite everything, this place was still loved. "The back room was my daughter's." Elias said, his voice catching on the words. "Lucy, you can have it if you want. I cleaned most of her things out after she passed, but there might still be some of her clothes that would fit you. Books, too, if you're inclined to read." "Where is she now?" Maggie asked softly, though something in her eyes suggested she already knew the answer. "Dead." The word came out harder than he'd intended, sharp enough to cut. 3 years ago this November. They said it was an Apache raid, but I never believed that story. Too many things about it didn't make sense. Something flickered in Maggie's green eyes, recognition, fear, or perhaps understanding. A look that suggested she knew more about mysterious deaths and official lies than any 16-year-old should. But before he could ask, she was walking toward the house, her slight frame moving with the careful precision of someone accustomed to navigating around danger. The kitchen was the cleanest room in the house, mostly because Elias still needed to eat, even in his darkest moments. He lit the oil lamp against the gathering dusk and began assembling what might pass for meal beans from a can hardtack that was only slightly stale coffee that had seen better days but would still provide warmth and comfort. "You don't have to stand by the door," he said, noticing how she pressed herself against the wall like a frightened animal ready to bolt at the first sign of trouble. "You can sit down. Look around. This is your home now, at least for as long as you want it to be." "Is it?" She moved cautiously to the kitchen table, perching on the edge of a chair like a bird ready to take flight. "Or is this just another transaction? Another man who owns me until he decides to sell me to someone else?" The question cut deeper than she probably realized. "I don't own you, Maggie. Nobody owns you. What happened back there that was about giving you choices, not taking them away? Men say a lot of things they don't mean." Her voice was flat, emotionless, the tone of someone who'd heard too many promises broken. "Some do. I don't." He set a plate of food in front of her, then took his own seat across the table. The beans were plain, and the hardtack was tough, but it was more than she'd had in days. "You want to know why I bought you? Really, why?" She nodded, though her eyes remained wary, ready to hear another lie. "Because 3 years ago, when my Lucy was in trouble, nobody stood up for her. Nobody helped her. Nobody even tried." His voice grew rough with old pain, with guilt that had festered like an infected wound. "She died alone and scared, and I wasn't there to protect her. I swore that would never happen again. Not if I could prevent it." "What kind of trouble was she in?" Elias was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup, as if it might hold answers to questions that had tormented him for years. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending tumbleweeds skittering across the yard. In the distance, a coyote howled, the sound lonely and desperate. "She was asking questions," he said finally. "About things that were happening in town, things that didn't make sense. Girls disappearing, families leaving, suddenly stories that didn't add up when you looked at them close." "Like what stories?" "Apache raids that happened when there weren't any Apache within 100 miles of here. Outlaw attacks that left no witnesses and no evidence. Accidents that were too convenient, too perfectly timed to be coincidence." He looked up, meeting her eyes directly. Lucy was smart. Too smart for her own good. She started piecing things together, started asking the wrong people the right questions, and they killed her for it. "I think so. But I could never prove it. Her body was found 10 miles from here, torn up bad. They said wild animals got to her, but..." He shook his head, the old anger rising like bile in his throat. The wounds were wrong. The location was wrong. Everything about it was wrong, but nobody wanted to listen. Maggie picked at her food, taking tiny bites while her mind worked. She'd heard stories like this before, whispered in the dark corners of saloons and around kitchen tables when the men weren't listening. Girls who asked too many questions, families who refused to accept official explanations, people who simply vanished when they became inconvenient. "The men who came for me tonight," she said carefully. "They work for Marshal Thorne." "They do?" My sister Sarah always said Thorne was behind the disappearances. Said he had connections outside the territory, people who paid good money for young women, willing or not. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Sarah was gathering evidence against him. Documents, witness statements, proof of what he was doing. Elias felt his pulse quicken. This was the closest he'd come to answers about Lucy's death, the first real confirmation of what he'd suspected for 3 years. "What happened to Sarah?" "She disappeared 6 months ago. Just like your Lucy, found torn up by wild animals about a day's ride from town." Tears began to track down Maggie's cheeks, but her voice remained steady. "But before she died, she told me something. Said if anything happened to her, I should find you." "Me why? Because you were the only person in Deadwood Crossing who asked questions about Lucy's death. The only one who didn't just accept the official story and move on." Maggie set down her fork, her appetite apparently gone. "Sarah said you were the only person she trusted to finish what she started." "What did she start?" "Gathering evidence against Thorne. Real evidence. The kind that could bring him down and save the girls he hasn't killed yet." Maggie's eyes blazed with sudden intensity, with a determination that reminded Elias painfully of his daughter. She hid it somewhere safe, somewhere Thorne would never think to look. Somewhere only someone who loved Lucy would ever find it. Before Elias could respond, the sound of approaching horses echoed across the yard. Multiple riders moving fast and with purpose. He was at the window in seconds, peering through the curtains at shapes moving in the darkness. 4 men, he said grimly. Maybe 5, coming from the direction of town. Maggie joined him at the window, her face pale but determined. "It's them. Thorne's men. They've come for me." The riders thundered into the yard in a cloud of dust and menace, their faces hidden by shadows and hat brims. Cobb Jackson dismounted first, his massive frame unfolding with predatory grace. Pete Dalton and Snake Morrison flanked him along with 2 other men. Elias didn't recognize hired guns by the look of them, brought in for this specific job. "Get to Lucy's room," Elias ordered, already moving toward his gun cabinet. "Lock the door and don't come out no matter what you hear." "What about you?" "I'll handle this." He checked his shotgun, made sure his pistol was loaded. Years of hunting and ranch work had kept his shooting skills sharp, but he'd never faced professional killers before. "Just remember what you told me about Sarah's evidence. If something happens to me, you need to find it. You need to finish what she started." "Elias, go." She ran, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. Elias heard the bedroom door slam, heard the old lock click into place. Then he was stepping onto the porch, weapons ready, preparing to face whatever came next. "Evening, Brody." Cobb called out, his voice carrying false friendliness. "Beautiful night for a visit. Stars are particularly bright tonight." "State your business," Elias replied, keeping his shotgun low but ready. "You know our business. We've come for the girl." Cobb took a step closer, his boots crunching on gravel. "Hand her over and we'll be on our way. No fuss, no trouble." "She's not here." "Now that's disappointing, because we know she is." Snake Morrison's reedy voice carried a note of amusement. "Saw you leave town with her. Simple arithmetic says she's here somewhere. Maybe she ran off. Girls do that sometimes when they're scared." "Maybe. Or maybe you're lying to duly appointed officers of the law." Cobb's hand moved to his gun. "That's a serious offense, Brody. Could land a man in considerable trouble. You boys aren't law. You're Thorne's dogs and everyone knows it." The insult hit its mark. One of the unknown gunmen stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "You watch your mouth, old man. Marshal Thorne keeps the peace in this territory. He's done more for law and order than law and order. Elias laughed bitterly. That what you call it when girls disappear in the night, when families pack up and leave without explanation, when anyone who asks questions ends up dead. Be careful, Brody. His voice carried a warning. You're walking a dangerous line. Might be best to step back before you fall off. I crossed that line the moment I stood up in Murphy's saloon. Now it's just a question of how many of you I take with me when I go. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. 5 against 1 were impossible odds, but Elias had advantage's high ground cover and the desperate fury of a man with nothing left to lose. Last chance. Cobb said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than shouting. The girl, or things get unpleasant? Go to hell. Have it your way. The first shot shattered the night like thunder muzzle flash, lighting up faces twisted with violence. Elias dove behind the porch railing as bullets splintered wood around him, the sound of gunfire echoing off the mountains like artillery. He came up firing his shotgun, taking Snake Morrison center mass and dropping him in the dirt. The spread was tight at that range, and Morrison went down hard, his rifle spinning away into the darkness. But the others were already spreading out, using Elias's own outbuildings for cover, turning his property into a battlefield. A bullet tugged at his hat brim close enough to part his hair. Another splintered the post inches from his head, sending wooden shards flying like shrapnel. He worked the lever on his rifle, sent a round into one of the unknown gunmen, watched the man spin and fall. The odds were still against him, but he was fighting for something that mattered. Every shot was carefully aimed, every movement calculated to maximize his advantage. These men were professionals, but they were also overconfident, used to easy victories against unarmed civilians. Brody. Cobb's voice carried across the yard. You're outgunned and outnumbered. Give up now and maybe we'll make it quick. Instead of answering, Elias put a bullet through the water trough Cobb was hiding behind, forcing the big man to scramble for new cover. The shot was perfect, sending a geyser of water into the air and demonstrating that nowhere in the yard was truly safe. But even as he fought, he could feel the mathematics of the situation grinding toward inevitable defeat. His ammunition was limited, his position was exposed, and the attackers were adapting to his tactics. It was only a matter of time. Then the bedroom window exploded outward in a shower of glass and splintered wood. Maggie rolled through the opening, hit the ground running, and sprinted toward the barn. She'd changed into some of Lucy's old clothes, a simple dress that fit her better than her own rags, and her hair streamed behind her like a battle flag. There she goes, Pete Dalton shouted, spurring his horse after her. The carefully maintained tactical situation collapsed into chaos. Dalton rode hard after the fleeing girl, while the others tried to maintain their positions and keep Elias pinned down. But the distraction gave him the opening he'd been waiting for. He broke cover, advancing on Cobb's position with his rifle blazing. The first shot caught Cobb in the shoulder, spinning him around. The second took him in the chest, dropping him permanently. The big man's gun flew from his hand, and he collapsed without a sound. But Dalton had reached the barn, his horse rearing and whinnying as he tried to corner Maggie. The girl dodged between the animal's hooves with desperate agility, but she was trapped with nowhere left to run. Elias sprinted across the open ground, knowing he was exposing himself to the remaining gunmen, but unable to watch another young woman die on his property. A bullet whined past his ear, another kicked up dust at his feet, but he kept running. Dalton raised his pistol, aiming down at Maggie's upturned face. End of the line, little girl. Elias's shot took the deputy in the side, punching him sideways off his horse. The man hit the ground hard and didn't get up again. But the victory was short-lived. The last of Thorne's men, a thin, nervous gunfighter with darting eyes, had flanked around behind the barn. His rifle was trained on Maggie's back, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Drop your weapon," the gunman shouted. "Drop it now, or the girl dies." Elias found himself in the nightmare scenario every man feared, forced to choose between his own survival and the life of someone under his protection. The gunman's rifle was steady, his position commanding. One wrong move, and Maggie would be dead. "Easy," Elias said, slowly lowering his rifle. "Easy now. Let's all stay calm. Kick it away from you." He complied, the weapon clattering across the hard-packed earth. Now he was defenseless, at the mercy of a man who had none to give. "Please," he said, raising his hands. "She's just a kid. Let her go. Take me instead." "Marshal Thorne wants the girl alive," the gunman replied. "You, on the other hand, you're just a problem that needs solving." The rifle swung toward Elias, and he knew his time had run out. He'd failed again, just like he'd failed Lucy. Another daughter would die because he wasn't strong enough, fast enough, good enough to protect her. But as the gunman's finger tightened on the trigger, Maggie did something that saved both their lives. She started talking. "Wait," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet. "Before you kill him, don't you want to know about the railroad?" The gunman hesitated, his rifle wavering. "What railroad?" "The spur line they're planning to build through this valley. Worth millions to whoever controls the land rights." Maggie's voice grew stronger as she spoke, weaving truth and fiction into a tapestry of hope. "My sister found out about it before she died. Found the survey maps the government contracts the names of the men who stand to profit. It's all hidden with the other evidence." "You're lying." "Am I? Then why do you think Thorne wants this land so badly? Why does he keep buying up failed ranches for pennies on the dollar?" She took a step closer to the gunman, her eyes blazing with desperate intelligence. "Because he knows what's coming. He knows this worthless desert is going to be worth a fortune." The rifle lowered slightly. Greed and uncertainty warred in the gunman's face as he tried to decide what to do. Information was valuable, potentially more valuable, than following orders blindly. "Where?" he demanded. "Where is it hidden?" "I'll tell Marshal Thorne personally," Maggie replied. "Face to face, but only him. Not you, not his other dogs. Him." It was a desperate gambit, buying time they didn't have with information that might not exist, but it worked. The gunman lowered his rifle completely, his mind already calculating the reward Thorne would pay for intelligence about railroad development. "Marshall's going to want to hear this," he muttered. "Going to want to hear this real bad." That moment of distraction was all Elias needed. He dove for his fallen rifle, rolled, came up firing. The bullet took the gunman high in the chest, dropping him before he could react. Sudden silence fell over the ranch like a blanket. 4 men lay dead in the yard, their blood soaking into the thirsty earth. The survivors stood among the carnage, breathing hard, trying to process what had just happened. "You saved my life," Elias said quietly. "You saved mine first." Maggie was shaking now, the adrenaline wearing off and leaving exhaustion in its wake. "Is it over?" No. Elias began reloading his weapons with methodical precision. "This was just the beginning. When these men don't report back, Thorne will send more. Probably come himself this time. Then we need to find Sarah's evidence. Tonight." "Do you really know where it is?" "I think so." Sarah was always clever about hiding things. When we were little, she had a dozen secret places where she kept her treasures. But there was one place that was special. One place she said was just for the most important secrets. "Where?" "Lucy's grave." The words hit Elias like a physical blow. "What?" "Sarah knew your daughter. They were friends, worked together at the general store sometimes. After Lucy died, Sarah used to visit her grave every week, bring flowers, talk to her." Maggie's voice grew stronger as she spoke. She said Lucy was the bravest person she'd ever known, and if she had to hide something precious, she'd want Lucy to watch over it. Elias felt tears prick his eyes. The thought of Sarah visiting Lucy's grave, of his daughter's memory being honored by someone who'd barely known her, touched something deep in his soul. "The cemetery's 5 miles from here. We'll need horses." They gathered supplies in grim silence, food, water, ammunition, blankets. The horses were skittish from the gunfire, but they calmed under Elias's experienced hands. Within an hour, they were riding north through the darkness, leaving behind the ranch and the bodies of men who'd chosen the wrong side of justice. The cemetery sat on a hill overlooking the valley, a small plot of consecrated ground where Deadwood Crossing buried its dead. Lucy's grave was marked with a simple wooden cross and a handful of wildflowers that someone Sarah apparently had left recently. "There," Maggie said, pointing to a spot near the headstone. "See how the earth's been disturbed? Someone's been digging here." They worked by moonlight, using their hands to carefully excavate the loose soil. About 2 feet down, Elias's fingers touched something hard, a metal box wrapped in oiled cloth to protect it from moisture. "This is it," Maggie whispered, her voice filled with awe and grief. "This is what Sarah died for." Elias lifted the box with reverent care, feeling the weight of secrets and truth in his hands. Inside were dozens of documents, financial records, correspondence, witness statements, even photographs of girls who disappeared. Evidence that painted a picture of corruption so vast it reached from Deadwood Crossing to the territorial capital. "Oh my God," he breathed. "This is everything. Names, dates, payments. Enough to bring down half the territorial government. And enough to get us both killed if Thorne finds out we have it. Then we make sure he doesn't find out. Not until it's too late for him to stop what's coming." But even as he spoke, the sound of approaching horses echoed across the hills. Multiple riders moving fast, guided by the same logic that had brought them to the cemetery. If Thorne's men had searched the ranch and found the bodies, they would know their quarry had escaped. And a smart man like Marshal Thorne would have anticipated exactly where they might go. "They've found us," Maggie said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "Not yet, but they will." Elias looked around the hilltop, calculating distances and angles. The cemetery offered some cover among the headstones, but not enough to withstand a sustained assault. "We need to get out of here." "Where can we go? Thorne owns the law, owns the businesses, owns half the people in the territory. There's nowhere to run." "Then we don't run. We fight. 2 against how many?" "As many as it takes." Elias helped her mount her horse, his movements calm and purposeful. "But not here. We need better ground, better cover. Somewhere we can make them pay for every inch." The sound of horses was getting closer, echoing off the canyon walls like thunder. Soon there would be torches, shouts, the organized brutality of men who killed for money. But for now, there was still darkness, still the possibility of escape. They rode hard toward the mountains, following deer trails through scrub brush and broken stone. Behind them, the cemetery stood silent under the stars, keeping its secrets and theirs. The old silver mine crouched in the hillside like a wound in the earth, its entrance partially collapsed, but still passable for those desperate enough to try. Elias and Maggie reached it, just as dawn began to paint the eastern sky, in shades of rose and gold, their horses lathered with sweat, their own clothes torn by thorns and stones. "This is it." Elias stared at the dark opening, noting the rotting timber supports and the scatter of loose rocks that suggested imminent collapse. "Sarah and I called it the Devil's Mouth when we were children," Maggie said, already dismounting. "It goes back about 200 yards, then branches into several tunnels. Most of them are flooded or caved in, but there's one that's still safe." They led their horses into the main chamber, grateful for the cool darkness after hours in the desert sun. The air inside was thick and stale heavy, with the smell of mineral deposits and something else, something organic and unpleasant that made Elias's stomach turn. "Oh, something died in here," he said, pulling his shirt up over his nose. "Probably just a coyote or mountain cat. Animals come in here sometimes to escape the heat. Sometimes they don't make it back out." But Maggie's voice was tight with tension, and her eyes constantly scanned the shadows. They made their way deeper into the mine, following the main tunnel as it curved and narrowed. The walls were carved from solid rock scarred by pickaxes and blasting powder, testament to the dreams of men who'd sought fortune in the earth's bones. After about 100 yards, the tunnel opened into a wider chamber where shafts of sunlight filtered down through cracks in the ceiling, creating an eerie twilight atmosphere. "This is where we used to play," Maggie said, settling onto a flat rock that might once have served as a work table. Sarah would tell stories about the miners who used to work here, about the treasure they left behind when the silver ran out. We'd pretend we were explorers searching for lost gold. Happier times. The only happy times. She pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around them. After Mama died, after Daddy started drinking, this was the only place that felt safe. Elias found his own seat on a pile of old mining equipment, his rifle across his knees, his ears tuned for any sound that might indicate pursuit. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant drip of water and the occasional creak of stressed timber. "Tell me about Sarah," he said quietly. "Really tell me this time." Maggie was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns in the dust. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "She was everything I'm not. Beautiful, brave, smart. 3 years older than me, but she always looked out for me, even when Daddy got mean. What made her start investigating Thorn? A girl named Emma Jackson disappeared about a year ago. Emma's father was one of Daddy's drinking partners, and he came to our house crying, begging Daddy to help him find her. The official story was that she'd been taken by raiders, but Sarah knew that wasn't true. How did she know? Because Emma had told her she was planning to leave town anyway. She'd gotten a job offer in Denver, working for a respectable family as a governess. She was supposed to take the afternoon stage, but she never made it to the depot. Elias felt pieces of a puzzle clicking together in his mind. Someone intercepted her. Sarah thought so. She started asking questions, checking with the stage depot, talking to people who might have seen Emma that day. What she found didn't make sense. Witnesses who changed their stories, official reports that contradicted each other, evidence that seemed to disappear overnight. And that led her to Thorn. Eventually, she discovered that several other missing girls had similar stories, all young, all pretty, all planning to leave town for jobs or marriages elsewhere. And all of them disappeared just before they could get on stages or trains heading out of the territory. The implications were chilling. A systematic operation targeting vulnerable young women at their most hopeful moments. Elias felt rage building in his chest, hot and righteous. "How many girls?" he asked. "At least 15 that Sarah could document." "Probably more." Maggie's voice grew stronger as she spoke, as if sharing the burden was lifting some weight from her shoulders. She found a pattern. They all worked for businesses connected to Thorn somehow. The general store, the hotel, the telegraph office. Places where he could monitor their plans, their correspondence, including Lucy. Sarah thought so. "Your daughter worked at Milligan's store, helped with the books, handled mail orders. She would have seen things, heard conversations, maybe even handled telegrams that revealed too much." The sound of horses echoing off the canyon walls made them both freeze. Multiple riders moving slowly now, methodically searching. The hunt had found their trail. 6 men. Elias whispered, moving to a crack in the rock where he could observe the canyon below. Maybe 7. And there's someone else with them, someone in a marshal's coat. Thorn. Maggie's voice was tight with fear. "Has to be. Big man, silver hair, wearing a badge that gleams like gold. That's him." "Then we're dead. Thorn doesn't take prisoners, and he doesn't leave witnesses." "Neither do I." Elias checked his weapons, counting ammunition. "How many ways out of this place?" "Just the one we came in. The back tunnels are all collapsed or flooded." "Then we make our stand here." "Elias, there are 7 of them, and 2 of us. The mathematics are simple." "That mathematics change when you're fighting for something that matters." He looked at her directly, seeing Lucy's fierce determination reflected in her green eyes. Your sister died gathering that evidence. My daughter died trying to stop Thorne's operation. We're not going to let their deaths mean nothing. Before Maggie could respond, Marshal Thorne's voice echoed through the mine entrance, amplified by the stone walls into something almost godlike in its authority. Brody, I know you're in there. Let's discuss this like civilized men." The voice was cultured, educated, carrying the weight of legal authority. But underneath the civilized veneer, Elias could hear something cold and deadly, the voice of a predator wearing the mask of civilization. "Nothing to discuss." Elias called back, positioning himself behind cover. "I think there is. You have something that belongs to me, the girl, and certain documents that were stolen from my jurisdiction." "Don't recall stealing anything from you, Marshal?" "No. Then perhaps we should discuss the 4 dead men I found at your ranch. Murder is a serious crime, Brody. Territorial offense. Could see you hanged by the neck until dead. Self-defense isn't murder. That depends on who's telling the story." Thorne's voice carried a note of amusement. "And I'm the one who writes the reports in this territory. I decide what's murder and what's justified. I decide who lives and who dies." The conversation was a stalling tactic, Elias realized. While Thorne kept him talking, his men would be positioning themselves, finding firing angles, preparing for assault. Every second he spent in dialogue was a second closer to death. "What do you want?" he called out. "Simple trade. The girl and the documents for safe passage out of the territory. You can take your horses, your guns, enough supplies to reach the Colorado border. After that, you're someone else's problem. And if I refuse, then you die in that hole like the cornered rat you are. Your choice, Brody. But choose quickly, my patience isn't unlimited." Elias looked at Maggie, saw the terror and resignation warring in her expression. She was already preparing herself for sacrifice, already accepting that her life was forfeit. It was an expression he'd seen before in Lucy's eyes, in the moments before she'd tried to save those other girls. "Don't," she whispered. "Please don't trade your life for mine." "I'm not trading anything. I'm investing in the future." He moved to a different position, trying to get a better angle on the mine entrance. "Besides, your sister didn't gather all that evidence just so Thorne could destroy it. Time's up, Brody." Thorne's voice had lost its false friendliness. "Last chance to do this the easy way. Go to hell. Have it your way. Boys, smoke them out." The first shots came like thunder muzzle flashes strobing in the darkness of the mine entrance. But these weren't aimed shots. They were just noise and fury designed to keep the defenders pinned down while other men moved into position. Elias returned fire, his rifle bucking against his shoulder as he sent rounds toward the advancing shapes. He had the advantage of position. They could only come at him through the narrow entrance. But he was vastly outnumbered, and his ammunition wouldn't last forever. Then something unexpected happened. The sound of gunfire was joined by another noise, a deep, ominous rumbling that seemed to come from the earth itself. Dust began to rain from the ceiling, and the wooden supports creaked under enormous pressure. "The mine's not stable," Maggie shouted over the din. "All this shooting, it's bringing the whole place down." As if to emphasize her point, a chunk of rock the size of a man's head crashed to the floor nearby. The mine was old, its supports rotted by time and moisture. The vibrations from the gunfight were shaking it apart. "We have to get out of here." Elias grabbed Maggie's hand, pulling her toward what he hoped was the safest tunnel. But Marshal Thorne had anticipated this move. He appeared at the tunnel mouth, his own gun drawn, blocking their escape with deadly efficiency. Up close, he was even more imposing than Elias had expected, tall and silver-haired, with the kind of presence that commanded respect and fear in equal measure. "End of the line," Thorne said calmly, his voice barely audible over the groaning of stressed timber and stone. "Drop your weapons." Elias found himself looking into the face of the man who had terrorized the territory for years, who had murdered his daughter and countless others. Thorne was younger than he'd expected, maybe 45, with cold blue eyes that held no trace of human warmth. "You're the famous Marshal Thorne," Elias said, keeping his rifle trained on the man's chest. "Smaller than I expected. Size isn't everything, Brody. Power is what matters. Authority. The ability to make people disappear when they become inconvenient." Thorne's smile was razor sharp. "Your daughter learned that lesson. Eventually." The taunt hit its mark. Rage flared in Elias's chest, hot and consuming. "What did you do to Lucy?" "Nothing she didn't deserve. Girl should have minded her own business, kept her nose out of affairs that didn't concern her." Thorne's gun never wavered. But she was stubborn, just like her father. Had to be taught some hard lessons before she understood her place. "You son of a bitch. Careful, old man. Your language is becoming inappropriate for mixed company." Thorne glanced at Maggie, his eyes appraising her like livestock. "Speaking of which, Miss Ashford and I have business to discuss. Private business. Over my dead body. That can be arranged." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, 3 people with guns trained on each other in a space that was slowly collapsing around them. Dust continued to rain from the ceiling, and somewhere in the darkness, timber was beginning to splinter under impossible weight. But then something happened that changed everything. A new voice cut through the tension, young female and achingly familiar to Maggie's ears. "Nobody move, I've got a gun on all of you." Everyone turned to see a figure silhouetted in the tunnel entrance. A young woman with dark hair and green eyes, holding a rifle with professional competence. She was thin, marked by months of hardship and hiding. But her stance was confident, and her voice carried absolute authority. "Sarah," Maggie's voice broke on the name. "Hello, little sister. Sorry I'm late to the party." The reunion was brief but electric. Sarah Ashford stepped into the chamber, her rifle never wavering from Marshal Thorne's chest. She was alive, scarred, but unbroken, carrying herself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd survived hell and emerged stronger. "You're supposed to be dead." Thorne said, his composure finally cracking. "Reports of my death were greatly exaggerated." Sarah replied with a cold smile. "Though I appreciate you believing them. Made it much easier to gather evidence against your operation." "What evidence?" 6 months' worth of documentation, witness statements, financial records. Everything from your little arrangement with the territorial governor to your partnerships with brothel owners in Denver and San Francisco. Sarah's voice was steady, professional. "I've been working with federal marshals, Marshal Thorne. Real marshals, not corrupt local officials." The revelation hit the chamber like a thunderbolt. Federal intervention meant Thorne's local authority was meaningless. His political connections, worthless. He was trapped, cornered, facing the collapse of everything he'd built. "You're lying," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Am I? Then perhaps you can explain why Deputy U.S. Marshal William Hayes and his men are currently surrounding this mine." Sarah's smile widened. "They've been tracking you for weeks, waiting for the right moment to move. I've been their inside source, gathering evidence from the shadows." As if summoned by her words, new voices echoed from the mine entrance, authoritative, professional, backed by federal law. The cavalry had arrived at last. "Marshal Thorne." The voice was crisp, official. "Deputy U.S. Marshal Hayes, you're surrounded. Come out with your hands up." Thorne's face went through a series of emotions, surprise, rage, calculation, and finally, cold determination. He was trapped, but he wasn't finished yet. "Even if that's true," he said quietly, "none of you will live to testify. This mine's coming down, and everyone in it will be buried under tons of rock. Tragic accident, really. Local marshal dies heroically trying to rescue civilians from a cave-in. As if to emphasize his point, another section of ceiling collapsed, filling the air with dust and debris. The mine was indeed unstable, shaken to its foundations by the gunfight and the natural settling of old excavations. "You're insane," Elias said. "I'm practical. Dead witnesses can't testify, and federal marshals can't arrest a corpse." Thorne began backing toward a side tunnel, his gun still trained on them. "Goodbye, Brody. Give my regards to your daughter when you see her in hell." But as he turned to flee, Maggie did something that surprised everyone. She stepped forward directly into his line of fire. "Marshal Thorne," she said calmly, "there's something you should know about that evidence we found." "What?" Despite himself, Thorne hesitated. "It includes your personal journal, the one you kept locked in your office safe, the one where you wrote about every girl you've murdered, every family you've destroyed." Maggie's voice was steady, implacable. "Sarah found it 3 weeks ago. Photographed every page. The federal marshals have already seen it." The lie was perfect, delivered with such conviction that even Elias almost believed it. But it had the desired effect. The Thorne's face went white, his hand trembling slightly on his weapon. "There is no journal," he said. "Isn't there? Then how do we know about Emma Jackson's last words, about how she begged for her life before you strangled her with your own hands?" Maggie took another step forward. "How do we know about the others, about what you did to them before you killed them?" The accusations hit their mark. Thorne's composure cracked completely, revealing the monster beneath the civilized facade. "You know nothing. I know everything." Maggie's voice was cold as winter stone. "I know you're a coward who preys on the innocent. I know you're a failure who hides behind a badge because you're too weak to face the world as you really are. And I know you're going to die in this mine, buried under the weight of your own sins." The psychological assault was devastating. Thorne raised his gun, his face twisted with rage. But the ceiling chose that moment to give way completely. The collapse came with a roar, like the end of the world, tons of stone and timber crashing down in a cloud of dust and destruction. Elias dove toward Maggie, trying to shield her with his body, but the falling rocks separated them. He felt something heavy strike his shoulder, sending bolts of agony down his arm. When the dust settled, he found himself trapped in a pocket of space, barely large enough for one person. His rifle was gone, buried under rubble, and his left arm hung useless at his side. Blood trickled down his forehead from a gash on his scalp. "Maggie." He called out, his voice hoarse from dust and pain. "I'm here." Her voice came from somewhere to his left, muffled but strong. "Sarah, are you all right?" "Trapped, but alive." Sarah's voice came from the opposite direction. "The tunnel's blocked, but I can hear voices from outside. The federal marshals are trying to dig us out." "What about Thorne?" Silence. Then faintly the sound of labored breathing. The marshal was alive, but injured, trapped like the rest of them in the ruins of his own making. Elias began working his way through the rubble, using his good arm to move smaller stones, following the sound of Maggie's voice. The space was treacherous, loose rocks that could shift and crush him at any moment, but he kept moving, driven by the need to reach her. He found her wedged beneath a fallen timber, her legs pinned but apparently unbroken. Her face was streaked with dust and blood, but her eyes were alert and determined. "Can you move?" he asked, already working to shift the beam. "I think so." "What about your arm?" "It'll hold." The timber was heavier than it looked, but desperation gave him strength. "We need to get out of here before the rest of this place comes down." Working together, they managed to free her from the debris. She was bruised and shaken, but able to walk. They began making their way toward the sound of Sarah's voice, climbing over fallen rocks, squeezing through gaps barely wide enough for human bodies. They found Sarah trapped in a similar situation, pinned by debris, but conscious and alert. Together, Elias and Maggie managed to free her, though the effort left all three of them exhausted. The entrance is completely blocked, Sarah reported. But I can hear the marshals working. They're using dynamite to clear the rubble. How long? Elias asked. Hours, maybe longer. This is going to be a major excavation. Behind them, Marshal Thorne's voice rose in a mixture of pain and fury. You can't leave me here. I'm a territorial marshal. I have authority. You had authority. Elias called back without looking. Now you're just a man trapped in a hole. I'll make you pay for this. All of you. I have connections, influences. They'll hunt you down. Let them try. But even as he spoke, Elias could hear the change in Thorne's voice. The marshal was badly injured, probably dying. The collapse had been as merciless to him as to his victims. The rescue took 18 hours. Federal marshals worked in shifts using controlled explosions and careful excavation to clear the blocked entrance. When they finally broke through, sunlight flooded into the chamber like a benediction, and fresh air rushed in to replace the stale atmosphere of the tomb. Elias and the sisters were lifted out on stretchers, exhausted but alive. Marshal Thorne was carried out as well, unconscious and barely breathing. He would survive long enough to stand trial to face justice for his crimes, but his reign of terror was over. The evidence Sarah had gathered, combined with what federal investigators found in Thorne's office and personal effects, painted a picture of corruption that reached all the way to the territorial capital. Dozens of officials were arrested, businesses were shut down, and a network of human trafficking that had operated for years was finally dismantled. The missing girls were mostly never found, but a few were rescued from brothels in distant cities, brought home to families who'd given them up for dead. Emma Jackson was among them, alive, but scarred, grateful beyond words for the justice that had finally come. The trials made headlines as far away as San Francisco and Chicago. Marshal Cale Thorne was convicted on 17 counts of murder and sentenced to hang. He went to his death unrepentant, cursing the names of those who'd brought him down. His deputies received various sentences, some hanged, others imprisoned. A few who'd cooperated with federal investigators were given lenient treatment in exchange for their testimony. The entire corrupt structure of law enforcement in the territory was replaced with honest officials sent from Washington. Elias used his reward money from the territorial government to buy a small spread north of Deadwood Crossing, far enough from the town to avoid painful memories, but close enough to stay connected to the community that was slowly healing. The ranch was modest, but prosperous, worked by 3 people who'd found family in the aftermath of tragedy. Maggie proved surprisingly capable with horses and cattle, her quick mind and steady hands, making her invaluable in the day-to-day operations. She'd grown into a confident young woman, her past trauma healing slowly but surely under the care of people who loved her unconditionally. Sarah took over the books and correspondence, her experience with investigation and documentation, making her a natural administrator. She'd also begun writing first letters to newspapers about the corruption they'd uncovered, then longer pieces about the need for federal oversight of territorial law enforcement. But the real healing came in the quiet moments, dinners around the kitchen table, evenings on the porch, watching the sunset, conversations that sometimes lasted until dawn. They'd built something new from the ashes of their old lives, something stronger than blood and deeper than obligation. On the 3rd anniversary of Lucy's death, Elias stood at her grave with flowers in his hand and peace in his heart. The wooden cross had been replaced with a proper headstone paid for with money earned through honest work. The inscription was simple, but true. Lucy Catherine Brody, beloved daughter and hero, 1858-1878. She died fighting for justice. I brought visitors, he said to the stone, then stepped aside to let Maggie and Sarah place their own flowers. She would have liked us, I think, Maggie said softly. She would have loved you, Elias replied. Both of you. You're exactly the kind of people she admired most, fighters who never gave up, no matter how dark things got. As they walked back down the hill together, Elias reflected on the strange turns his life had taken. 3 years ago, he'd been a broken man, drinking away his failures, waiting for death to claim him. Now he was the father of two remarkable young women who'd survived the worst the world could offer and emerged unbroken. Lucy would have approved, he thought. She'd always believed that good could come from even the darkest circumstances, that love could grow in the most unlikely soil. She'd been right about that, as she'd been right about so many things. The future stretched ahead of them, uncertain, but no longer hopeless. There would be challenges the ranch to run the community, to help rebuild the ongoing work of healing from trauma. But they would face those challenges together as a family bound not by blood but by choice. In the evening quiet of their home, with the sisters planning the next day's work and the cattle settling down for the night, Elias would sometimes sit on his porch and remember. He would think about the daughter he'd lost and the daughters he'd found, about the circular nature of love and loss and redemption. The past was buried, but not forgotten. The present was full of purpose and meaning. And the future was bright with possibility. Sometimes in the gathering dusk, he could almost hear Lucy's voice on the wind, telling him she was proud, telling him he'd chosen well, telling him that love never really died. It just found new places to grow. And in those moments, surrounded by the family he'd never expected, but couldn't imagine living without Elias Brody, knew peace. The town of Deadwood Crossing had changed as well. New businesses opened, honest lawmen patrolled the streets, and children played in squares where fear had once ruled. A small monument was erected in the town center, honoring the victims of Marshal Thorne's reign of terror and the courage of those who'd fought to end it. But perhaps the most important change was invisible. The slow return of hope to a community that had learned to live without it. People spoke freely again, asked questions without fear, stood up for their neighbors when trouble came calling. It wasn't paradise. It never would be. But it was home, and it was free, and for the first time in years, that was enough.